They called her worthless because of her skin, but when a lonely millionaire farmer saw her, he knew she was worth more than gold. This is the story of how rejection turned into a love no one saw coming. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. No one expected a black woman to answer an ad for a wife in the dusty plains of Kansas, but Clara did. With trembling hands, she sealed the letter that would change her life forever. In that cramped laundry house on the edge of St. Louis, Clara had spent years hunched over steaming tubs, scrubbing other people's clothes while they barely looked her in the eye. She'd grown used to the burn of lye soap on her hands and the ache in her back, but she'd never gotten used to the way folks looked through her, as if she were made of shadows and steam. It was late one night, long after the other women had fallen asleep on their cots, that Clara found the old newspaper crumpled under her thin pillow. She almost threw it away, but there, tucked between ads for farm tools and cheap whiskey, she saw it. Lonely farmer seeks good-hearted wife. Room, board, and love promised to the right woman. Clara read the words 3 times, her heart fluttering like a sparrow caught in a storm. She knew she wasn't the kind of woman men lined up for. She was plain, her skin the rich brown of river mud after rain, her hair coiled tight against her head. But maybe, just maybe, someone out there wanted a heart more than a face. Maybe someone wanted kindness more than fair skin. She wrote back that same night, her pencil trembling in her cracked fingers. She told him about her cooking, about her steady hands, and her quiet nature. She didn't mention the laundry house or the nights she cried herself to sleep. She didn't mention how the world had taught her that black women like her weren't meant to dream too big. She just signed it, Clara Johnson, and sent it west with her last nickel for postage. 3 weeks later, the reply came. Inside a plain envelope was a note written in a rough but careful hand. Dear Miss Clara, your letter warmed my heart. I ain't got much but the land, the house, and the promise of honest work. If you're willing, I'd be proud to have you stand beside me. Yours in hope, Walter McBride. Clara didn't tell the other women. She just folded her few belongings, her one blue dress, the Bible her mother left her, and a worn photograph of her father in his Sunday suit. She boarded the train before dawn, when the world was still quiet and full of promise. The train rattled west through miles of flat land and sun-bleached fields. Clara pressed her forehead to the cold glass window and dreamed of warm bread, a sturdy table, and a man who would look her in the eye when he said her name. She imagined laughter in the kitchen and sweet tea on the porch. She imagined children who'd run barefoot through tall grass, never knowing the weight of the world she carried in her chest. When she stepped off the train in Kansas, the wind cut through her thin coat like a blade. She clutched her small bag tighter and searched the platform. At the far end, leaning against a post, stood a man in a battered hat and work coat. He was taller than she expected, his hair sandy and his face creased by sun and hard years. Clara? He called, his voice cautious but kind. She nodded, too shy to speak at first. Walter walked over and took her bag from her hand. He smelled of earth and hay, and when he smiled, Clara felt a flicker of warmth deep in her bones. The farm was smaller than she'd pictured, a clapboard house leaning slightly to the east, a barn that looked as tired as she felt. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Walter showed her the kitchen, the single bedroom they'd share, the quilt his mother made before she passed. That first night, Clara lay awake on the straw mattress, listening to the wind scratch at the windows. She thought of the laundry house, the steaming tubs, the silence that swallowed her whole. She turned toward Walter, who slept with one hand tucked under his cheek like a boy. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, if the neighbors would accept her, if Walter's warmth would hold when the harvest failed or the winters bit hard. She didn't know if love could bloom in soil that had never known her roots. But as the Kansas wind howled around their little house, Clara whispered a prayer into the darkness. Lord, let him see my heart. Let this be enough. And with that, she closed her eyes, clutching her mother's Bible to her chest, hoping the plains would keep her dream alive, warm enough to outlast the cold. When Clara stepped off the train, dusty wind catching her bonnet and whipping her hair loose from its pins, she saw him. John Miller, taller than she'd imagined from his letters, with sun-browned skin, sleeves rolled up to show arms strong from years of plowing Kansas earth. He held his battered hat in his hands, twisting it as he scanned the passengers disembarking. When his eyes landed on Clara, he froze. For a heartbeat, there was something soft in his gaze, surprise, maybe, or hope. But then his eyes darted around the platform, to the conductor, to the cluster of townsfolk who'd come to see who'd arrived. On the morning train, Clara lifted her chin, smoothing her blue dress with trembling fingers. She'd spent the last of her coins to press that dress clean. She'd imagined him smiling, stepping forward to lift her suitcase, maybe tipping his hat like a gentleman should, but John only stared. He looked at her once, then again, and his face fell like a barn door unlatched in a storm. "You didn't say you were," he began, voice low, words snagging on the wind that rattled the loose boards of the platform. He wouldn't finish the sentence. His eyes shifted away from her face, over her shoulder to the cluster of men and women gathered behind her. Clara felt their eyes crawl over her skin like cold insects. She could hear it already, the sharp hiss of whispers. A colored woman? Here? With him? John dropped his hat to the dusty planks at his feet. He bent to pick it up, thought better of it, and just kicked it like a guilty boy trying to hide his shame. Clara clutched her suitcase so hard her knuckles turned pale against her dark skin. The worn handle bit into her palm, grounding her, keeping her from sinking into the floorboards under the weight of their stares. "I came all this way," she said, the words small but steady. She'd practiced what she might say when she first saw him. "I'm so pleased to meet you, Mr. Miller. I'll work hard, I promise. I'll make you proud." But now all she could do was stand still as the sun baked her shoulders through her. Thin-dressed, John's eyes flicked to hers. For a second, regret flickered there. But then he looked past her again, to the townsfolk still watching. A few men leaned against crates, smirking. A young girl whispered something to her mother, who shushed her with a sharp tug of the arm. John cleared his throat. "I can't marry you," he said, almost apologetic, but his voice cracked at the edges like dry earth. "They'd never accept it. I'm sorry." Clara's chest tightened, a fist closing around her ribs. For a heartbeat, she thought. She might beg, "Please, I've come so far. Please, you wrote me. You promised." But she could see it in the slump of his shoulders, the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. Whatever kindness he'd once written on paper had withered under the glare of neighbors and the weight of their small-town judgment. Behind her, the train hissed like a snake, the final boarding call echoing across the empty platform. But there was no ticket home for Clara. Home was gone, sold for the fare west. The laundry house wouldn't take her back. She was a woman alone in a place that didn't want her. Clara turned slowly. The suitcase felt heavier now, a lead weight that pulled her steps down into the dusty earth. As she stepped off the platform and onto the sun-baked dirt road, she heard them. The whispers, the soft mocking laughter. A stray dog trailed behind her, ribs poking through patchy fur, as if even it pitied her enough to keep her company. She kept her eyes straight ahead, past the wagons and storefronts, past the staring faces peering from behind curtained windows. The Kansas plains stretched wide and empty beyond the town, the sky too big to hold all the loneliness inside her. She didn't know where she'd sleep that night. She didn't know what she'd eat or who might slam a door in her face when she asked for work. But as she walked, each step kicking up tiny clouds of dust, Clara repeated her mother's words under her breath. The words whispered to her long ago when the world first taught her it wouldn't be kind. "Keep walking, baby. Don't let him break you. Keep walking." So Clara did. With her blue dress wrinkled and her dream torn at the seams, she walked into the harsh Kansas sun with the wind at her back and hope flickering, stubborn and small, somewhere deep inside her battered heart. For days, Clara slept in an old barn on the edge of town, tucked behind a shuttered general store no one seemed to miss. By day, she listened for footsteps that never came, afraid someone would chase her off like a stray dog. By night, she laid her thin shawl over the loose hay, the straw poking through the weave to scratch her skin at a sunrise. She'd slip down to the creek, hidden behind the cottonwoods that lined its banks. She'd scrub her hands raw in the icy water, trying to wash away the smell of sweat and fear. She'd splash her face and run wet fingers through her hair until it lay flat again. Then she'd sit by the water's edge, Bible open in her lap. whispering prayers to a sky so wide it made her feel small enough to vanish. Each night, she asked the same thing. Lord, you brought me this far. Don't leave me now. But the barn stayed empty. The wind rattled the loose boards and carried her prayers away. One dawn. Hungry and bone-tired, Clara decided she'd risk the road again. She tied her bundle tight. The Bible, her mother's handkerchief, the last crumbs of cornbread she'd saved. She walked along the dusty road with her head down, watching her shoes kick up little puffs of Kansas dirt. Her belly ached, but worse than that was the ache in her chest, the hollow place where hope should have been. She didn't hear the horse at first, not until its hooves clopped close behind her, the jingle of tack breaking the morning quiet. Clara stiffened, her fingers tightening around her bundle like a shield. You looking for work, ma'am? His voice startled her, gentle, yet carrying the easy command of a man who owned the land under his boots. Clara turned, squinting, at the sun behind him. He sat tall on a sturdy bay horse, a wide-brimmed hat shading a face lined from years in the fields. His beard was neatly trimmed, his clothes simple but clean, work trousers, a faded shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Clara lowered her eyes, the way her mother had taught her when men spoke. No one hires my kind, she said softly. Her words drifted off like dust on the wind. The man tipped his head, as if trying to see her clearer. Your kind? He repeated, and then he laughed, not sharp and mocking like the townsfolk had, but warm, like a creek thawing after a hard frost. Ma'am, I see a woman with good hands and eyes that don't quit looking. That's the only kind I need. Clara dared to lift her gaze to his face. His eyes were a soft brown, crinkled at the corners as if he spent more time smiling than frowning. My name's Matthew Harris, he said, swinging a leg over and dropping from the saddle with an easy grace. He stood a head taller than Clara, broad-shouldered but not intimidating. He offered her a hand, palm open, not grabbing, just waiting. I own the biggest wheat farm round these parts. 100 acres, give or take. House too big for one man since my wife passed. He paused, studying her. I got fields that need tending. Fences need mending. Cookhouse needs a steady hand. Clara's mouth felt dry as old bone. She wanted to believe him, but her chest squeezed tight with all the ways trust could be broken. She thought of John Miller on the train platform, his face folding in on itself at the sight of her skin. I don't want trouble, she whispered. Matthew's smile faded, but only for a heartbeat. Ma'am, you won't find trouble with me, long as you're honest and work hard. He hooked a thumb back toward his horse. Got an extra bunkhouse. Clean, warm, hot meals 3 times a day, if you can cook better than me, and that ain't hard. Clara felt something loosen inside her. Not quite hope, but maybe its small cousin, the part of the heart that refuses to die even when the rest of the world says it should. You'd really hire me? She asked, so quiet. She almost hoped he wouldn't hear. Matthew's eyes twinkled under his hat brim. Miss, I don't care if you're pink, purple, or polka-dotted. My fields don't harvest themselves. You help me, I help you. That's the bargain. So Clara nodded. She didn't trust him, not yet. But when you've got nowhere to sleep and nothing to eat, sometimes the face of a stranger can look a lot like mercy. She let Matthew lift her bundle onto his horse. She climbed up behind him, her hands pressed lightly to the saddle's edge. As they rode toward the golden fields rolling far as her eyes could see, Clara breathed in the scent of wheat and dust, and for the first time in days, she let herself imagine she might belong somewhere, even here, on this stubborn land that had almost broken her. Weeks turned to months, and the farm became more of a home than Clara had ever dared dream. She rose before the sun, slipping out into the cool dawn, to gather eggs while the chickens clucked sleepy protests. She learned which boards in the coop creaked the loudest, which hens liked to peck her apron strings, which corners of the barn hid mice she'd chase away with her broom. In the afternoons, she hung fresh curtains in the big farmhouse windows, their cheerful prints brightening rooms that had once felt too large and too empty for just one man. She patched worn shirts and mended torn pockets. She baked cornbread that smelled so good the field hands found excuses to linger near the porch, hoping for seconds at night, when the fields grew quiet and the prairie winds rustled the wheat. In soft hushes, Clara would sit in the parlor with Matthew. She read aloud from the Bible or from old books Matthew's wife had left behind. Stories of far-off lands Clara had never seen, but could now picture with her eyes closed. Sometimes she caught Matthew watching her over the rim of his coffee cup, his eyes tired but warm, a small smile hidden in his beard. At a tea first, the townsfolk talked behind their hands. They whispered in the pews at Sunday service about the rich farmer who'd brought a black woman into his home. Some claimed she was a charity case, some a scandal waiting to happen. A few just stared, open-mouthed, when Clara stepped into the church beside Matthew for the first time, his arm hooked firmly in hers, his chin lifted as if daring anyone to say a word. Whispers turned to gasps when Matthew stood beside her during hymn singing, his voice rough but steady, his shoulder brushing hers like they'd been side by side for years. After the service, when the preacher shook Clara's hand without flinching and told her he was glad to see her there, some folks looked away in shame. Others looked harder, as if trying to find the thing that made this union so impossible. But Clara only smiled, small at first, then wider as Matthew squeezed her fingers, reminding her she was exactly where she belonged. Seasons shifted. The wheat fields turned gold, then pale again under the winter frost. Clara grew stronger. With each passing week, muscles in her arms firm from hauling water and carrying firewood, her back straighter than it had ever been in that steam-filled laundry house she'd left behind. She laughed more, sang to herself while she swept the porch. Sometimes she'd catch Matthew leaning in the doorway, just watching her with a look that said the farm had grown softer under her touch, and so had he. Then, one cool evening as spring tugged at winter's frayed edges, Clara found him waiting by the chicken coop. She'd gone out to check on a ruckus, an old hen squawking at nothing. She nearly tripped when she saw Matthew kneeling there in the dirt, his hat pushed back, hair tousled by the breeze that carried the scent of wheat and fresh-turned earth. He held out a small velvet box, and when he opened it, the ring inside caught the last pink light of the sunset. Clara blinked, certain she'd imagined it, that the ring was a trick of dusk and hope. "Marry me, Clara," Matthew said, his voice rough like gravel but steady as a promise. "I've got money and land and more wheat than I'll ever know what to do with, but I ain't got a good woman to share it with, unless you say yes." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She thought of that day stepping off the train, John Miller's eyes sliding away from her like she was nothing worth standing up for. She thought of nights in the cold barn, praying for a reason to keep walking. She thought of her mother's Bible tucked under her pillow upstairs, pages worn soft by her whispered prayers. She dropped to her knees in the dirt beside him, hands trembling as she reached for his face. Tears slipped free, warm against the cool night air. "Yes," she whispered, the words so small but so mighty it felt like it could split the sky open and let all her dreams pour down. "Yes, Matthew Harris, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, its band snug and shining against her rough hands. He pressed his forehead to hers, his laughter low and soft in the twilight. Around them, the chickens clucked sleepily, the stars blinked awake one by one, and the Kansas wind carried Clara's yes out across the fields, carrying it far enough that maybe, just maybe, it would find every woman who'd ever believe she wasn't enough and remind her that sometimes hope grows where no one expects it to. Their wedding wasn't grand, not the kind written up in fancy papers or whispered about in parlors with fine lace curtains. It was just Clara and Matthew standing under an old oak tree that had seen more Kansas sunsets than any man alive. Its branches spread wide above them, heavy with green leaves that shivered in the soft spring breeze. Clara wore a borrowed white dress from the preacher's wife, a little loose at the waist, the hem trailing in the grass. She'd pinned wildflowers in her hair that morning, her hands trembling as she twisted the stems just right. She'd never worn white before, never thought she'd be the woman waiting for the words "I now pronounce you man and wife." A few farmhands came, men who'd worked Matthew's fields for years and now called Clara ma'am with smiles instead of side glances. The preacher's wife stood beside her, pressing a folded handkerchief into Clara's palm when tears gathered faster than she could blink them away. And there, tail wagging like it belonged, sat the same ragged dog that had once followed Clara down that lonely road when her heart was near to breaking. It lounged in the shade by her feet, lifting its head now, and then, as if to remind her it had known all along, she'd find her way home. When the preacher spoke the final words, Clara barely heard them over the rush in her ears, the rush of old fears being washed away by something bigger than she'd ever dared pray for. When Matthew took her hand in his rough, sun-browned one and pressed his lips to her knuckles, he didn't whisper promises of riches or easy days. He just called her Mrs. Harris, his voice warm and certain like a sunrise that would never fail her. In that moment, Clara knew she'd never again stand on a train platform, suitcase in hand, hoping to be wanted. She'd never again pray for someone to see past her skin to the good woman inside. Because the man beside her didn't look past her. He looked right at her, saw every part, and loved her all the more because of it. Of course, people in town still talked. They always would. There were still tight-lipped women who crossed the street rather than nod hello, and men who tipped their hats stiffly but kept their eyes narrow. But for every cold shoulder, there were two warm ones. Neighbors who saw the wheat grow twice as high that year, the chickens fatten under Clara's careful tending, and Matthew's smile stretch wider than it ever had in all his years alone. Some folks said the farm thrived because the land was good that season. Others said it was just luck. But the old-timers, the ones who'd seen more winters than they cared to count, said it plain enough. The Harris place bloomed because it finally had a heart beating inside it. And that heart was Clara's. Clara walked through town with her head held high now, her Sunday dress pressed crisp, her hair pinned neat, with a blue ribbon Matthew bought her from the general store. She'd stop by the schoolhouse with baskets of eggs for the teacher, drop off fresh bread for the preacher's wife, and sometimes slip coins into the church box for any soul who found themselves hungry and wandering like she once was. Years turned slowly, as they do on wide Kansas plains. The fields changed with the seasons, but the story stayed the same, passed down in quiet voices over fence posts and supper tables. Folks still tell it today. The story of the black bride who was rejected for her skin by one man too weak to stand beside her, but loved for her heart by another who knew that love didn't care about what small minds whispered behind closed doors. They say sometimes love doesn't knock on the door you expect. It doesn't come dressed in the promises of a newspaper ad or the stiff smiles of men too worried about gossip to stand up for what's right. Sometimes love waits for you in a dusty field, riding up behind you on horseback with a voice that says, "I see you. I see the good in you, and I want to build my life around it." And maybe, if you're brave enough to hold your head high and say yes when the world tells you no, you'll find that love blooms even in the hardest soil. So if you loved this heartwarming story of hope and courage, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us true love always finds a way, even when the world says it can't. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Clara? Would you have stayed, or kept walking until you found the door that opened wide just for you? Sheaf of rice ring sparkles.